hearing from lots of British Columbians that were all giving us some variation of the same message, which was, can you please make sure that you don't unnecessarily divide the vote and allow the NDP to have a better chance of being able to stay in government? Unfortunately, I have to stand and tell you today that John Rustad ultimately made the decision that that's not something that he wants to proceed with, and he is going to put his personal ambitions as he views them above the best interests of the province.
Well, that's Kevin Falcon. He's the leader of BC United. We used to call them the BC Liberals, announcing that coalition talks with the BC Conservatives are over, and that means vote splitting on the right is likely going to continue. And it's good news for BC's Premier David Eby and his NDP ahead of a provincial election. And this got very ugly very quickly. Conservative leader John Rustad saying that Kevin Falcon publicly saying he wants to put his ego aside. Privately, any discussions or offers have been completely unserious, dishonest. By the way, that's actually some of the nicer stuff in that statement. It is one of the most beautiful places in Canada, but boy, oh boy, things can sure get ugly when it comes to BC politics. Let's bring in the front bench. Sabrina Grover, she was a candidate for the federal Liberals in the 2021 election. She's now a principal at Shakti Strategies. Melanie Paradis, the communications director for former Conservative leader Erin O'Toole. She's now the president of Texture Communications. Gurudhan Singh, he was a member of the Ontario Provincial Legislature. He represented the New Democrats. Now he is the vice president at Crestview Strategy, also the brother of federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. And our very own eagle-eyed senior digital parliamentary reporter here at CTV News, Rachel Aiello at our bureau in Ottawa. Great to see all of you, and happy Friday. Let me start with you, if I can, Mel, on this, because this is a battle on the right. Your thoughts on what we're seeing in BC?
Well, you know, it is, like you said, it's a beautiful province, but these politics have certainly gotten a bit ugly. So I think we're seeing a trend across the country, certainly from Ontario westward, of provincial Liberal parties just completely tanking in the polls. And in this particular case, we've got the formerly known as the BC Liberals Party at like 12%. They're tied with the Green Party. So they are not in contention to win in the next election. So they're not coming into these negotiations or these talks about a potential merger or a non-competition agreement of some sort from a position of strength, that's for sure. The Conservatives are absolutely the party that are in the position of strength because they're looking great in the polls right now. One of the things that was proposed for this plan was to divide up the ridings 50-50, and that the BC United would run their candidates in 50% of the ridings, and then BC Conservatives would run their candidates in the other 50%. Why would you do that with a party that only has 12% in the polls? It doesn't make any sense. Like you're hurting yourself and your ability to form government. So I think that the BC Conservatives were absolutely right to stop these conversations and say, like, you know what, we're going to go it alone. It's not a reasonable starting point for a negotiation to ask for 50% when you only have 12.
Yeah, to you, Gurudhan, and your take on, if I can ask you, the ego that sometimes plays out here. You're the leader of one party, you're the leader of the other party. You would like to form the next government, and trying to make concessions. One party has more seats, but is way back in the polls. The other party has very few seats, but is way ahead in the polls. Both see an opportunity, perhaps neither willing to make the compromises necessary.
Well, what's clear is that these two right-wing parties are unable to work together for the benefit of their own base. That's the reality here. And instead of them actually focusing on their own bases, they rather just fight amongst themselves. And I say the more the better, because ultimately it's preventing the right-wing parties that would cut our healthcare systems, cut the services that British Columbians really rely on, and it's allowing an NDP government that's already very popular in the polls, irrespective of this vote split, but it's securing them and frankly their policy, which has been benefiting those who need it most. It's investments in healthcare, it's investments in the services that people rely on. It's also standing up for the right issues to make sure that those who are most vulnerable in our society have a government that has their back. So it clearly demonstrates the inability for both these egos to work for the benefit of their own base. But beyond that, I think this is ultimately a win for BC, because it's going to keep the progressive and very dynamic NDP and Premier Eby in power.
Yeah, well, David Eby, no doubt happy man tonight to see these talks collapse. How about you, Sabrina? What do you think?
I think I didn't realize that ego played a role in politicians' lives. I'm shocked to learn that for the first time. I think from Dave Eby's perspective, like certainly I would be like very happy about this, not only to see a split on the right, but to continue to see these parties attack each other, right? And now some of the work that Dave Eby's going to have to do to attack the Conservatives is also going to come from BC United. And I think, as Mel has already pointed out, that party is so low in the polls that I think that it also creates an opportunity for Eby to move a little bit to the center on some of those issues and catch some of those people that are thinking, well, where am I going to park my vote now? It doesn't look like Kevin Falcon's even in the running. Who am I going to support? And so I think that there's lots of opportunities for the NDP to benefit from this. I think that the Conservatives made the right choice, of course, in not merging. There's no really reason for them to tie themselves to BC United. But what John Rudstead's going to have to watch out for are some of his quirkier or kookier candidates. I think that Kevin Falcon did make a good point earlier on this show saying that he had some really strong candidates. And I'm not sure that the BC Conservatives have that depth on their bench. And so it'll be interesting to see how they manage that problem.
Rachel Aiello, I got to say, I read this statement from the Conservatives and John Rudstead, and I mean, really, it's astonishing. And I want to read another little bit to all of us and people at home. He says, this is again about Kevin Falcon. Time and again, and in this offer, Kevin Falcon has demonstrated he will always put himself first and will do absolutely anything for power before the BC United Party, before his own candidates, and ultimately before the province. I mean, that is, stuff that you rarely see in Canadian politics, and certainly not written down in a statement that's sent out to the media.
Yeah, Todd, when I was reading this statement, I was kind of wondering to myself, like, did Pierre Poilievre's speechwriters kind of help him script this? Because a lot of what's in here, even this line about this Conservatives fighting against the radical NDP and restoring common sense, those are all concepts we've heard Poilievre repeat here federally. So I was just curious about that line and whether there was any consideration about the federal dynamics at play right now. We're hearing Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre extensively pin the NDP to the Liberals through their supply and confidence deal, calling them a coalition. Every time they're up in their house, he's talking about this Liberal NDP government. And so it's a curious thing to think about. There could have been a perspective where there was, I guess we would call it a former Liberal Conservative alliance in British Columbia. So I just think it was an interesting exercise, I guess, in some negotiating talks. Clearly ended in acrimony here, Todd. But I do wonder what lessons were kind of brought into that conversation from what they've seen play out federally.
So back to you, Mel. How do you stop vote splitting in BC, given what we've seen today?
Well, I think they just need to charge ahead, perhaps have a different plan and fully go on their own. The Conservatives would go on their own and not worry about the Liberals. Like, they're at 12% right now. And by all accounts, that they may continue to tank further than that. It sounds to me like they're really just trying to save the furniture at this point in time. And it's not going well. Like, the Liberal brand is so damaged across the country. Like, that is why they rebranded themselves the BC United instead of referring to themselves as the Liberals, because they were trying to stop the bleeding. But unfortunately for their party, they've just been they've been marred by that Liberal brand so strongly, and it doesn't look like they're bouncing back from it. So again, we're seeing this trend across the country with Liberal provincial parties doing really poorly. And I think that the BC Conservatives are going to be in a really interesting position in this next election.
Yeah, I mean, we want to be clear, the BC Liberals are always centre-right. The rebranding, though, Guritin, your take on that, from BC Liberals to BC United, no doubt hoping that would, bring them a refresh and voters would take a second look. It doesn't really seem like that's resonating. Let's be clear, we're still months away, but right now, not looking so good.
Well, let's also clarify that one point. This is not actually a BC Liberal Party that's rebranded to the BCUP. This is actually a Conservative Party that rebranded, that was initially called the Liberals in a very bizarre fashion. All of us east of BC were always confused of why a Conservative Party was called the Liberal Party. I guess as an NDP, I see Liberal, Tory, same old story. But with respect to this, we have a center-right party and a further right party fighting each other. So this is a really interesting dynamic. And I think what it really demonstrates is that the BCUP rebrand will probably go down in Canadian politics as the worst rebranding that has occurred and having the most negative impact. They wanted to distance themselves from a party that really wasn't their values anyway, since they were actually Conservatives. They chose a really cumbersome acronym that people still struggle with how to refer to them as. And now their lunch is getting eaten by a party whose name they probably should have adopted from the get-go. So this is the right eating the right now. And as a progressive, I'm sitting back and enjoying the show.
Yeah, you're right. Is it the BC United Party, the BC United, just United? It gets a little confusing on that. To you, Sabrina, as well, and just touching on something that Mel and Garutan were talking a little bit about, this idea that, you know, perhaps if you are the leader of the Conservative Party in British Columbia, which of course has always struggled going back many, many years, you start to think, well, you know, given what's happening federally and how far ahead the Conservatives are with Pierre Poilievre, maybe we have an opportunity to break through here in British Columbia. So why do I want to, you know, hitch my wagon to the folks over at BC United?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that there's little to come out of benefit for the BC Conservatives to even like think about merging with the BC United. At 12%, it doesn't really make any sense. But I do also think that there is some risk hitching their wagon fully to the federal Conservatives, right? Like there's a long runway till October. And while the Conservatives are still doing well in the polls right now federally, there's still some risk that they might falter. And I think that it also really depends on what do people in BC care about. And the top three issues that people in BC care about were healthcare, the cost of living, and affordability and housing. And I think that so far, the Conservatives haven't really come to the table with a plan for that federally. And I don't really think they're coming to the table with a plan for that provincially. So do they have any credibility in actually solving those issues, or is Premier Eby going to kind of, coasting with some of his plans to actually make a difference on those three issues?
Yeah, last word on this to you, Rachel Aiello. How does it play out? What do you think we're going to see?
I do think what you hit on there, Todd, about looking at Pierre Poilievre's recent run in British Columbia and whether the federal Conservatives are able to kind of help buoy the provincial Conservatives is going to be something to watch in this ongoing race. I think we've seen Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre spend a lot of time in British Columbia and certainly trying to make gains in some of the outskirts regions around Vancouver. So that is certainly something I would imagine that the provincial party is keeping an eye on, and even in this echoing of common sense language, potentially a ship they're trying to ride to their own electoral success.
All right, we're going to get our front bench to stick around.